helped stop the Australian arrest of Thomas Jefferson. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
Wow, we're going in a different direction now, aren't we?
We are going in a very different direction. This year, 2020, has been a quite successful year in the context that we stopped the cash ban. That was what we discussed in our last show. So we defended the right to use legal tender without criminal sanction from the federal government. Now we go on to a very new battle, which is coming up. We have a committee in federal parliament. There's the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. And last week they started an inquiry into extremist movements and radicalisation in Australia. And submissions are due in I think the 12th of February. And so there is a very fundamental question that this inquiry, I think, has to address. And we'll get into this in a second. But the question is that when we have a runaway tyrannical government, do we have the right to rebel or to revolt, in order to defend our rights? Because under Australian law, as we speak, any form of violence is illegal. Any discussion of violence against the government is subject to surveillance. And there was a example only last week where an 18-year-old person in Albury, New South Wales, posted certain comments about violence against the government, and the New South Wales police arrested this person on the basis of an abundance of caution. Not that there was a concrete conspiracy to commit violence or anything like that. It's like, don't talk about it, you can't do it. And obviously there has been a long tradition in England, as well as in the United States, about using violence against the sovereign, against the government, when you get a government that is basically out of control.
So there's a couple of intersecting things here, isn't there? The first is, what is the definition of extremism and all of those sorts of things, and who defines what is extremist?
Yes.
Right. And then the second is, what are the options for society if, in fact, the extremism lever goes one way or the other way, and the government is driving it?
Indeed. So why don't we put the website up for people to have a look at? Now I've started to work on a very long submission, and I'm going to really try to make a go of this. But the first question is, how did this inquiry come about? Peter Dutton, as the Minister for Home Affairs, has written to the committee and said, can you do an inquiry into extremist movements and radicalisation in Australia? And so since 9/11, radicalisation and extremism has been around Islamic extremism and radicalisation. But one of the things that's been catching the attention of policymakers is that there's been a so-called explosion in what they call as far-right extremism for the last 4 years. Now, back in 2016, ASIO's counter-terrorism caseload, looking at far-right extremism, was about 10%. Only last month they testified to Parliament saying it's between 30 to 40%. So they're saying that there's been a huge explosion. And when it comes to Islamic terrorism or extremism, they say that it's concentrated in Sydney and Melbourne. Whereas when it comes to far-right extremism, it's typically white Australians, young, spread across the country, driven by social media. So that's what is driving that whole subject. And I should say that the two key pieces of legislation I've been able to find which really try to address this issue is, so you have the ASIO Act, which talks about surveillance, and it talks about security, and it talks about politically motivated violence. And then you have the Criminal Code Act, which has a whole host of specific crimes defined in the law around treason, treachery, the urging of violence against the Commonwealth or the Constitution or the government, etc., and a few things like that. So I've started to sort of map out in terms of what all that means.
Right. So what is extremism and radicalisation then? What does it mean?
Well, so basically the way the law is defined, from what I can see at the moment is, and so I will start to have a bit of a look at state law. So I think some of the state parliaments have defined things under state law, but federal law, basically, anything that is of a violent nature against the government, that is extreme, that is radical. Now, when it comes to so-called far right or far left, there is no specific definition that I can find, whether it's in the law or whether it's in any operational documents by, say, the ASIO or the Australian Federal Police. So there's a bit of vagueness about, well, what do you mean by far right extremism? What is far right versus far left? Because for example, some people may say neo-Nazis is far right, and yet an objective analysis of the Nazis they were a socialist party, so they're of a member of the left. So you can get into semantics about, well, what does it all mean? But basically they're saying that if you have a grievance with public policy, there is a non-violent mechanism to go through. And we did that with the cash ban. Yep. So you can go through Parliament, so you can petition your parliamentarian, you can participate in the parliamentary process, you can stand for Parliament if you wish, you can engage in civic discussion through the media or through public meetings, etc. Or if it requires a situation, you can go through the courts. So that is all inbound. But once you start to talk about any form of violence, that's out of bound.
Right. So it is fundamentally about behaviour, and particularly violent behaviour, rather than expressing particular views or not expressing those views.
Yeah. So it's about behaviour, but the expression of that behaviour as well.
Right.
So for example, it would be unacceptable if we said, had the Parliament passed the cash ban, we were going to take up arms and cause a revolution. That would have been unacceptable to even discuss the proposition of violence against in terms of the government. And my key issue is what some of the literature on extremism and radicalisation is missing is if the politicians are not doing their job. We've seen enormous amounts of scandals, financial, economic, etc. Huge numbers of scandals. Public policy is going in the wrong direction. The public policy outcomes are going in the wrong direction. And we could point to housing. It's too hard to get housing. The cost of living index that you run, financial confidence, mortgage stress. There's a whole bunch of things that you could practically say people don't feel happy at the moment about their life, their circumstances. Obviously, COVID-19 has been a tumultuous year for a lot of people, and people just don't trust the institutions that are supposed to resolve these grievances. And so if people think my life is crap, the people who are supposed to make my life better are not doing a good job, to me, it would be natural that you would have a subset of this population that would start to talk, not perform violent acts, but at least to talk in violent terms. Now, so one of my core arguments in my submission will be is don't look for some band-aid solution around more laws, more spending, more surveillance. If you're going to resolve this issue of extremism and radicalisation, you need to rebuild trust with the people, and you need to start doing the people's business, whether about the economy or about a whole host of issues. So that, I think, is a key message that I want to impart on the committee, and I'm going to have a very direct and blunt way that I'm going to make that point. But that's, I think, a very important point, because ultimately. And whether it's about Magna Carta, English Civil War, American Revolution, Ballarat, and a few other examples, is what drives people to take up arms. It's when the political system becomes non-responsive. So when there are grievances that a lot of people are feeling, are hurting, and there's outrage, and no one is listening, and no one's responding to those grievances, that's when people feel compelled to go that one step further. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, and what I would think that has happened with COVID-19 and the response and the lockdown is you've got a lot of politicians who have a lot of money because of these taxpayer generous salaries who have been, I think, tone deaf about the impact of their policies. And yet the people on the receiving end have just been told to suck it up. And for some people, that has not been acceptable. And one of the elements of the terms of reference is so-called extremist groups are taking advantage of COVID-19. Well, maybe COVID-19 and the response to COVID-19 has just exacerbated a whole host of feelings that people have had for the last 4 years.
Yeah, and it seems to me, John, that if the easy, lazy response is to typecast those sort of concerns and objections as, fake news or, other stuff that shouldn't be allowed to be spoken about, right? And they'll accuse social media as being the mechanism which is creating all of this unease, right? It's actually missing the point, which is your critical point. There's a reason why this is happening at this stage, and it's the lack of performance of Parliament itself, and it's a lack of alignment to the interests of ordinary Australians, right? And the lack of awareness that they have to what the real issues are relative to ordinary people.